Okay, so this is going to be a little bit weird because I forgot to turn on the voice recording, so I'm having to do that separately. So first thing I'm doing is I have just taken this to spline, um, seeing how it looks right out of the gate. And it looks pretty good because the blocking was good. Um, Moving it out to get a better sense of the play blast. So, as I said, since the blocking was good, there really isn't all that much to do. Um, Mostly what I'm seeing there's a few timing and spacing issues with the ball that I'm going to fix through this. Uh, Fixing arcs with the feet um, as he's up in the air. Try to get that to happen a little bit more dynamically. And finally, the contacts both leaving the ground and coming back to the ground will need to be taken care of. So this is the first thing you do, and just examine it and see what you need to do. Examine it closely and be very picky. Don't settle for, animation's not something where you just kind of settle for good enough. You got to get it as good as you can possibly get it. So the list, as I see it, just a little bit of the timing and the spacing on the ball, arcs on the feet, make the feet a little more dynamic, fix any knee pops that I see, and the contacts both on the takeoff and landing. And of course I'll have to go through my graph editor, and which is where I usually start. I usually just select one thing at a time and kind of go through one at a time, see what I need to do. And the first thing I usually do is take everything that's going to be a constant value and make those flat so that you don't get any extraneous movement in between the frames. It's a very important step to go through and clean up your graph editor, because Maya by default will do a lot of strange things to your animation. Like if you just set it to spline and leave it at that, you're going to have a lot of weird extraneous movement that shouldn't be there. So I usually take anything that's going to be the same value, make sure they're flat towards each other, and then also I take the extremes of my movements, the ups and downs, and I make those flat. And I'll try to clean up my curves, try to get the keys to flow smoothly into one another. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to actually move the key to straighten out the curve, then it kind of behooves you to look in the graph editor while you're working at the graph editor. Also look at the screen as I'm doing here, to see what kind of effect you're having. Okay, and that's one of the other things that I noticed is the weight on that landing wasn't great. So I'm trying to accentuate the up and down motion, both when it's taking off and landing, just to really sell the weight. I've harped on you guys for this many times. Weight is extremely important to show. If your animation doesn't look like it's following basic laws of physics like gravity, then your animation's probably not very good. You can cheat the laws of gravity, you cannot ignore them. And when I say that, people always bring up Wile E. Coyote. Well, you know what? Wile E. Coyote, they cheated the laws of gravity, but they didn't ignore them. As soon as Wile E. Coyote would realize that there was no ground underneath his feet, all of a sudden the laws of gravity would kick in. So they really played with it, but they didn't ignore it. And anyways, even if your animation is very stylized, you still have to, come up with a set of natural. You have to. Um, you have to establish rules in your universe and make things consistent. Most of the time, when people do things, when students do things where the weight is wrong, and I point it out to them, and they argue with me, um, usually what it turns out to be is they just don't want to put the work in to get the weight to sell, either because they don't know how or they just see it as too much work. Again, animation is not something that you can approach in a half-assed way, because if you do, there's no way to make it look anything other than half-assed. Animation requires an extreme attention to detail. So here, I've made changes in the graph editor. After you make a change in the graph editor, always look at your animation and make sure that nothing strange has happened to it because of any changes that you made. Okay. So turning back on the curve so I can move on to another part. Again, the process is simple like this on a simple character. You don't have a lot of controls to play around with. And here I'd forgotten to take these to spline, so I'm doing it now. When you start getting more complex characters that have a lot of controls, this can start to feel like untangling spaghetti. So you got to really approach this in a very systematic and methodical way. And I have my process. I try to see what values aren't changing. Make sure that the keys are set to flat, and also that the extremes of the motions are set to flat, just so that there's no extraneous motion being created by Maya as Maya interprets these curves. If you leave things at the default in Maya, if you just hit spline and leave it at that, you're going to get really crappy results. There's just no way around it. And I think, as most of you have noticed by now, if you don't do your graph editor, I can usually tell that you haven't touched your graph editor before I open it up and look at it, because it's obvious in the animation. Yeah, and the reason it's obvious is you're going to have lots of unmotivated movements, things that don't make sense, like feet sliding about, like the foot kind of wavering up and down. Usually, if you've gone through the trouble of locking the feet down and if they're still wobbly, it's usually because you haven't touched your graph editor. With the bouncing balls, I used to see people's bouncing balls would, be going forward, and all of a sudden, sometimes they'd even go backwards, because there was just some funkiness in the graph editor that hadn't been cleaned up. And there's really no excuse for not doing it. It doesn't take that long. Yes, it is a pain in the ass. Yes, it's like untangling spaghetti, and it's not fun. But it's necessary. It's the nature of the beast. Okay, so after having cleaned up the curves, I'm cycling through the animation, making sure everything's still working correctly, trying to figure out where and what I'm going to need to do to fix the legs. And I think first I was going to be attacking the... Oh wait, I hadn't done the... That's another thing with this. You have to make sure that you also do the graph editor on your FK as well as your IK. And again, there I'm selecting all the extremes of the motion, making them flat. And there, I took the ends and I'm making those to be not flat, and the reason is, um, that needs to hook up with when you go, you're only in FK for the time that he's in the air, and then it switches back to IK, and I don't want to have a slow out at that point. So you need those to be in a constant direction. Now, a lot of people, will ask me if you're keyframing everything on just about every frame, which in most cases you shouldn't be doing, unless you've got a fast movement that you need to do that to justify keyframing on every frame. But even if that's what you do, you still need to go into the graph editor and do this stuff. You'll just have a lot more of it to do. And people say, why? Well, it's you're not having motion between keyframes, you're keying every frame. Well, that's true, but in most cases when you're doing animation, you also have to take into account motion blur. And motion blur is calculated not only at your keyframes, but between your keyframes. And if you've got a funky graph editor you haven't touched, what you'll get is you'll have the motion blur start going in different directions between the keyframes, and what you'll get a strobing effect on the motion blur. So this has to be done kind of regardless of, whether you're using the graph editor properly or doing everything to avoid it by keying everything on every frame. You still have to do it. Difference is you make a lot more work for yourself if you try to key everything on every frame. It's just, it's process-wise it's bad. Now there are times when you need to key on every frame, particularly when you've got a fast motion or when you've got something like the squirrel tail where everything needed to follow an arc and the computer wasn't going to give it to you. You had to create that arc frame by frame on multiple joints. Then yes, you need to key every frame. And also feet, a lot of times you'll need to go in there and set your IK feet. If you've got a walk cycle, you'll need to do that at every frame, and the reason for that is with IK you cannot get a decent arc, and to get a decent arc you pretty much have to go in there frame by frame. And as important as arcs are, you cannot skip them. So yeah, that's another circumstance where I'll probably go in and set keys every frame. But it takes a fair amount of time to go through the graph editor. And again, the process, you want that graph editor. You want your splines to be very smooth. So you want to clean them up that way, but you also want to make sure that there's no extraneous movement. So when you got anything where the values are the same like they are here, you have to make them flat. I usually take the extremes of the motions and make them flat as well. And to make your curve nice, a lot of times you have to go in and you have to break the tangents. I generally, as a rule, I'll go in and weight my tangents and break my tangents anyways to get real good control over it, depending on how much I have to do in there. In this case, it really wasn't worth my time to do that. I didn't really have a lot of complex spacing issues to work with, so in most cases when I was going through this, I just didn't feel the need to do it. As long as I made this is a pretty simple animation, so as long as I made the curves as long as the curves themselves were clean, I didn't really need to do that. The spacing was pretty much taken care of in my poses. And you should all pretty much have the hang of the graph editor by now. If you don't, it's because you've been ignoring it and not working with it. Which I got to tell you, the longer you delay learning it and getting good at it, the longer you're keeping yourself from becoming good at computer animation. It's a very necessary step. It's kind of a drag, but it's still very necessary. So after making those big changes in the graph editor, I play through my animation to make sure everything's going according to plan. I believe the next thing I was going to attack was the arcs on the feet. Okay, a little problem with my cell phone going off at inopportune time. So anyways, back to where we were. Checking the arcs on the feet. Or was I doing the contacts first? I can't remember. We'll soon find out. Oh, the suspense is killing me. Well, actually, I believe it's... Oh, I was going to be adjusting my timing on the ball because I wasn't happy with how the timing on the ball was working out, so I wanted to give everything some extra frames, give it some hang time. And as I remember, I actually screwed up by not selecting something that I needed. We'll soon find out. I think another thing I wasn't happy with is that I hadn't put enough rotation on the ball, and as such, with that line running right down the middle, I kind of, you produce the optical illusion that the ball itself was kind of staying steady, and just the bottom half of it was spinning. The legs were spinning like one of those ball puzzles that you open up. I just remember there was something I wasn't very happy with. And I'm never going to forget to record the narration again because it's a real pain in the ass to go back and do this, I gotta say. But at this point, I'm still looking at, bad arcs on the feet. The feet look really sloppy going up there and coming down. And the contacts are funky. And there are definite knee pops. So I wasn't happy with the hang time. I decided I needed to add additional keys because there was too much hang time. He was getting up there and just kind of staying up there, floating up in the air and then coming down. Like he is right now still. So as I remember, I had to go back and build that motion in there. And I screwed up because I didn't also change the rotates, and also I was still, my default keys weren't stepped, so this thing was turning out to be in stepped as I'm making changes to it. So it started to look really funky. It's just like totally hanging there in midair. No movement whatsoever. And those things can happen sometimes as you make changes. I should have gone into my preferences and set everything to happen on spline at that point. And I didn't realize that I wasn't, that I was still, every key I was making was in stepped, which made it, I was like really thinking, what the hell, as I'm going through this? It only occurred to me, after several minutes working on it, oh, so that's really wasn't very smart of me. As you see, I had to go in once I figured it out and fix everything that I had done. So as always, it really behooves you to be careful as you work, because it's really easy to screw things up in computer animation. It's frighteningly easy to do so. All this work simply because I forgot to go in and adjust my preferences before I did it. So you'll find that at one stage in a project, you'll want to set your preferences so everything is happening in stepped, but then later on, you're not going to want it to be that way. If you need to add keys and they start ending up being in stepped, it's just going to screw, it's going to screw up your whole process. It's going to screw up the and will result in additional, what should have been unnecessary work. So now I'm checking to make sure that what I fixed is actually fixed. One of the nice things about computer animation, which is also one of the things that makes it harder, is that you can go back and you can make major changes. When you are working in stop motion, if it's decided that a major change is needed, you have to do the whole shot over again from scratch. And with cell animation, if a major change is needed, it's not impossible as it is in stop motion, but It's very time consuming. It's very difficult. You know, it involves throwing a lot of drawings away and reworking them, which is expensive. Um, in computer animation, you can work iteratively in a way that you cannot in other forms of animation. Now, while that's nice, you know, you can really kind of strive for perfection. You can go back and make changes if something isn't working, which is nice, but it's also kind of a curse because if you're working in a professional setting, it means people are a lot more inclined to ask for changes, and sometimes major ones. Um, Here, I wasn't happy with the weight on the knees and the overlap. I wanted to build in some overlap, have them come up a little bit farther, come up extra to help sell the weight. So there's like kind of a double bounce. He bounces there, but then I added another small one, you know, where he exceeds his, you know, he goes farther than his final resting pose to build in some overlap, which also helps to sell the weight. So I'm again adjusting the timing on the hang time of the ball. And the reason I was doing that is because it was still feeling a little bit floaty up at the top. I wanted to have hang time, but I didn't want it to hang in one single spot, you know, for several seconds and then come down. You know, there's got to be perceptible movement. Um, Otherwise, it's going to look like it's just randomly floating up there, which will destroy any illusion of weight that you have. Now, there's several things that are going to give. Here I'm starting to attack the arcs on the feet, I think, or at least looking at them. There's several things that are going to give you a sense of weight. One, reversals. In this case, there's no spine to reverse, but the legs. Which is also kind of squash and stretch, but the legs go from very rigidly straight when he's coming down, and right up until he comes into contact with the ground, the legs become very rigidly straight, and then they compress almost all the way. Now that in itself goes a long way to selling a sense of weight, and then having overlap at the end, that that also helps give a feeling of weight on the landing. Now, on the takeoff, the fact that he's bending down all the way to compress his knees to build up energy for that jump, that also helps sell the weight. All these things help to sell the weight. And good timing and spacing that will give a good sense of there being gravity at work. Will also help to sell the weight. The other thing is squash and stretch. You can add a little squash and stretch on the controls. I tend to be fairly conservative with squash and stretch and try to show it more in the compression of the body than in an actual manipulation of a control for squash and stretch. Just because I don't think it looks as good in computer animation. It certainly looks wonderful in 2D animation, but the medium suits it much better. When you're working in 3D animation, I mean, things are supposed to be kind of solid, You do want to have some squash and stretch where appropriate, but I tend to be very conservative with it and try to get the sense of squash and stretch just more in what the compression of the body is doing. The compression through the legs, and not that I don't use squash and stretch, I certainly do. But, I tend to try to make it minimal, just because I think the results are better when you do. Okay, now there's some weirdness with the feet that I'm dealing with. They weren't perfectly planted. Also trying to offset them a little bit so that they're not perfectly twinned. I'm not sure. I think I might have deleted a key that needed to be there and caused some strange things to start happening. Now, I've drilled you guys a lot on making sure your contacts are correct, and it really, it's one of those things you don't notice. You don't watch film and notice, oh, those contacts are so great when he's picking up that pen. Gee, those feet never penetrate the ground. You don't notice it when it's correct, but you notice it when it's wrong. You really notice when contacts are incorrect. So it's kind of one of those thankless jobs to make sure your contacts are correct, but it's necessary because, if you don't, your work just looks sloppy and amateur and just generally bad. Even if everything else is great, if your contacts are bad, I mean, it's one of those things that just really stands out. So it is worth taking the time to make sure that they're good. Like I said, nobody's ever going to notice that they were good. It's kind of the curse of visual effects. I mean, if you've done your job right, then nobody notices. But people will notice when you haven't done it correctly. And that's, like I said, it's the curse. So you really have to take the time to make sure that the contacts are, happening correctly. I can't remember exactly what happened. Something happened that was making the foot act weird. Oh yeah, I know exactly what it was. It was the... no, I don't. I can't remember what it was. I just know something happened, and it frustrated me trying to figure it out. So you'll just have to suffer through it until I figure out what it was. Again, I recorded this video without recording the sound, and I'm doing it at a separate time, so I don't really remember everything that I was doing. Um, the process is always basically going to be the same. Here you're with this, and that was what was wrong. I didn't have my IK FK switcher set to stepped, and since that is not set to stepped, there was some weird motion happening between the frames because again, splines when they're not flat and stepped, you get movement between your keyframes, which was what was happening, why that foot was not planting correctly. So at this point, I was starting to get happy with the weight and the contacts, and I think I'm looking at the arcs right now, the arcs on the feet. And arcs are another thing that is, again, a thankless job. Nobody notices when you've got beautiful arcs, but they'll notice when your animation is poppy. To be an animator pretty much requires that you're willing to go in and just fix all the small details. Animation is definitely not something for the impatient person. It requires a tremendous amount of patience and attention to detail and willingness to do everything it takes to make a shot look good. And honestly, if you find that stuff painful, then animation, it may not be your thing. It should be deeply satisfying to you to get your animation to a point where you can sit back and look at it and not find problems, and to find that everything's working and working well, and you can show it to somebody, and they're like, "Wow, that's cool." It should be deeply, deeply satisfying, and the process of doing it should feel fairly addictive. When I sit down to animate, not that there's times I don't, there are certainly times I get frustrated with it, but that frustration will just fuel me to keep looking for solutions, and to just dive in and not accept anything less than as perfect as I can make it. And here I'm dealing with the up and down, trying to eliminate the knee pops. And as you can see, it's starting to shape up. It's starting to look good. The weight is feeling right. There's not a lot of knee pops. Not any bad ones anyways. I've worked on the arcs of the feet. The weight it's feeling okay. I think it wasn't quite right, and one of the things I was doing was trying to deal with that. And there's a few different ways that you sell weight. One is through anticipation, like this downward motion, the anticipation, which is also, technically you can think of it like squash and stretch also. And squash and stretch sells weight. Squash and stretch makes it feel like something's got volume. But this compression here, which you can consider both a squash and stretch and an anticipation, the bigger your anticipation is, the bigger your movement can be. And so anticipation can really help sell weight. It can really help sell forces, momentum when you jump. A good anticipation, a proper anticipation will help sell that. Your timing and spacing and arcs will help sell weight. particularly the timing and spacing. You know, when the ball goes up and he's got hang time in the air, you know, you see what you see in real life. You see the competing forces of his momentum, his thrust upward, fighting and eventually losing to gravity. I mean, that's familiar to you from you know, the day you were born. That's what you see in reality. So that helps sell weight. And acceleration downwards, you know, that helps sell weight. I mean, that's the timing and spacing, you know, acceleration upwards and downwards, and the hang time in the middle, and then overlap. You know, when it comes down, like a good, nice hard drop on those knees, and then coming up and exceeding the point where he eventually settles. You know, you get like kind of a double bounce here in the overlap, and that also helps to sell the weight. So all these things together, you know, for physical animation, you need several things. You need good, solid posing with balance. You know, you cannot ignore the way the body moves, like the hips especially. You need to know that one part of the body affects every other part of the body. And then you need solid principles. You need, you know, timing, spacing, arcs, anticipation, squash and stretch, and then the various forms of overlap. You need successive breaking of joints. You need drag. You need to break up your action so that not everything happens at once. And of course, if you got things like clothing and such, you know, you need to deal with those as a separate pass. But all these things, you know, they're the things that help make physical animation feel physical, to make things look like they weigh something. And all this is necessary before you start getting into the performance aspects of it. You have to solve the physical aspects of a performance first. You have to, in other words, you have to understand the body mechanics and how to make things, you know, obey physical laws. Even though those physical laws can be bent in animation, they still have to be there. But if you don't have that right, then you're not going to be able to sell your performance. So you have to get the body mechanics correct first. You have to get your forces correct first. Once that happens, then you kind of draw people into the animation because it feels real. And then they can start to believe the performance, the emotional performance in the actors. Now, throughout this session, you know, you've just been working on the basic principles. And really, that's, you know, you will learn additional things in following classes, but you will spend a lot of your time perfecting what you've learned as far as the principles go. So there I was just offsetting keys to make that jump up and landing to sell that a little bit better. And let's see what the weight is looking like. Now, you haven't worked with fully rigged biped characters yet, but you guys have learned pretty much everything you need to know to start doing so, which you will in the next class. And what you need to start working on fully rigged characters, again, it's just the principles, all the principles we've talked about, and you need to be strong at posing your characters out. You have to understand the mechanics of Maya, but, you know, as I've been pointing out, there's not really all that much you need to know about Maya to do character animation, provided that, you know, you've got the rigs are already pre-made for you. Here I'm just working on getting up the knee pops and working on the arcs of the legs at the same time. Try to take out that forceful pop that happens in the knee. But really, everything you need to know about that, about character animation, you've learned here. Um, with working on these simple assignments, and this ball character kind of completes it because it brings in the hip and brings in articulated limbs. um, Working with arms is really no different than working with legs in a mechanical sense, as far as Maya is concerned. Um, the things that are going to be different, you just have more to deal with. You have the entire spine that you got to make look fluid where it needs to look fluid and solid where it needs to look solid. You've got a head to deal with. You won't be working with facial expressions right away, but you'll have hands and fingers. But all the tools that you're going to need to work with that you have learned, and hopefully learn well. If you haven't learned them well, you're going to have difficulty going forward if you want to do animation. The principles are the foundation of everything. And if you don't have your principles down, there's really no way to compensate for it. You either have a fundamental understanding that you can apply to your animation, or you don't. And if you don't, you need to go back to it. I'm just looking at the feet, trying to decide if everything's flowing as nicely as it should. But there is a nice sense of weight to the character. And it's surprising how much effort it takes to create that weight. But there's a lot of things you have to think about in animation. Fortunately, they are all very simple things. There's just a lot of them, and you have to tackle them one at a time. And if you plan in a smart way and try to work in a smart and consistent way, animation really isn't that hard. It's not brain surgery. There's a lot of things to deal with, but like I said, they're all simple things. But it does require you to be very patient and very willing to go in and dig in the small details. And really just strive for as perfect an animation as you can. But that's it. I think this was the point. Yeah, I was satisfied with this character for what it is for this demonstration, and I'm done re-recording the voice, so that's it. So this is the last video you guys get. I hope everybody enjoyed the class, and for those of you who will be continuing, I'll see you in the next one.